My name is Yuki Tajima. I'm the rector here at Georgetown SFS Asia Pacific. This is another talk in our City, Imagination, and Change talk series, where we examine what cities, especially Jakarta, could be and what it takes to make it to get the changes to get there. At GSAP, we hope to convene deep thinkers to exchange ideas on the real problems of the day. And today's talk asks, what is it that makes an economy competitive? And what is the role of cities in such an economy? Indonesia's economy is at a crossroads. It's grown impressively over the past few decades, yet in recent years, the share of manufacturing has fallen, and with it, questions over who shares in the growth. Today, we have a very special guest in Bapak Tom Lembong, who brings his deep experience from both a successful career in the private sector and also in the public sector as the former Minister of Trade and the Minister of Investment, where he sought to promote exports, attract foreign direct investment, and improve the ease of doing business, something that I think a lot of us are hoping that continues. But as the recent turbulence has shown with the markets, there's still a lot of key challenges. I think there's a real sense of unease these days with the economy. So the question becomes, how can Indonesia chart a course through these challenges? With his wealth of experience and knowledge, former Minister Tom Lembong is uniquely qualified to give his thoughts on these issues. So it's a true honor to host Pat Tom here today. Moderating the talk is, of course, Professor Scott Guggenheim, who is the director of our policy labs, who previously worked at the World Bank and as advisor to President Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan. We'll begin with Pat Tom giving a few remarks, followed by moderated discussion with Prof. Scott. As with all our policy talks, we're very open to questions which will come from the audience towards the end. But without further ado, please welcome His Excellency, former Minister Tom Lembong.
Yeah, let me start. Thanks everybody for coming, and let me just follow on Yuki's introduction on how pleased we are to have Minister Lembong here today. I'd also like to give a small call out to Wendy Haryanto and the students from the Urban Studies class who are here today, who I know are all extremely interested in how this is going to develop. In today's conversation, we're going to have some opening remarks by Pat Tom. Then we're going to turn it into a conversation where I have a few prepared questions, and then we'll open it up for discussions from the audience. And so rules of procedure for that open discussion, I'd like to make a few opening comments on that. The first of these is that many of you would love to be asking Pat Tom many questions, so please keep your questions short and to the point so other people also have a chance to ask questions, and he has time to elaborate and answer. The second thing is we'll be taking 3 questions at a time so that we can get people's input together. Then Pat Tom will give an answer on them. So the focus of today's discussion, as Yuki said, is going to be about a range of topics that will go from thinking about the new global economy and Indonesia's role in that to questions about what kind of city should Jakarta end up being. So I'd like to start the conversation, the discussion with Pat Tom, by building on Mark Carney's recent speech at Davos, where he talked about how you're either going to be at the table of the new order that's being eaten, or you're going to be on the menu. And so I want to ask is a little bit about how Indonesia is going to be at the table rather than being part of the dinner offerings, and particularly on how you would see some of the strategic questions and opportunities for a country like Indonesia. So if we can start with that, if that's okay, Pat Tom. I think people are quite interested in seeing where does Indonesia fit into a fragmented world system where we don't really know where we're heading, but we do know that we're not going back.
Thank you so much, Professor Guggenheim, Professor Tajima, and Wendy, and everyone. First of all, thanks so much for having me. And it's great to see all of you here and senior friends such as Jim Castle and many others that I won't mention one by one, but it's great to be here. Always happy in these kinds of settings. To get straight to your question, Professor Guggenheim about Mark Carney's speech, right? It's interesting. Actually, I started socializing this notion of the so-called middle powers starting about 2.5 years ago, of a report from Lowy Institute, the think tank in Sydney. And if I remember correctly, it was actually titled The Middle Power Moment, right? And so the notion that the middle powers should band together, right, in a world where superpowers are becoming more unpredictable. I mean, that's something that I've been considering for a couple of years already, right? Uh, how does Indonesia navigate a situation like this? Uh, the concise answer for now, yeah, because I also want to try to be concise and make space so we can cover a wide range of topics. Maybe counterintuitively, maybe, right? What I believe becomes even more important in this kind of situation is what we call principles-based policy. Yeah. So it becomes really important to be very clear-minded what our principles are, what our values are, right? What our norms are. Like know thyself, right? Know yourself, know very well what we're about, and fight for that. And I've always believed that if we adopt a kind of approach, we would agree with, say, the US or the Western Bloc 70% of the time, disagree with them 30% of the time. We would agree with China 70% of the time, would disagree 30% of the time, but we would be consistent, number one. And our external partners or counterparties, at a minimum, would know why we disagree, right? It's consistent with our principles, our morals, right? Our values. Um, I believe, and in fact, I believe the last 1 year would show that trying to appease or mollify or even more extreme, like suck up, like to any particular powers, doesn't work. Yeah. So uh, a big, a basic back of the envelope sketch, right? Like tabulation suggests to me that those countries who actually took a firm stance, like a clear stance, a firm stance, didn't rush to appease or accommodate or suck up, right, are today in a better position compared to countries that rushed in, right, try to appease and what have you. And the negotiating dynamic just got worse and worse and worse, right? You think you have a deal, and then suddenly, you know, the goalposts are moved. And so not only you lose respect in the eyes of your counterparty, your negotiating counterparty, you start losing self-respect, right? So again, taking a bit of a contrarian approach, I actually think in a very transactional geopolitical environment, it's all the more important that your principle, right? And this is a big underlying dynamic, I believe, to what Prime Minister Carney was talking about is the middle powers kind of banding together. Why? Because we subscribe to the same values, because we have a commonality of values and principles, right? We're upholding into the principles that we all believe in as democracies, as rational societies, as forward-looking societies, right? As pragmatic societies, right? That's why we're getting together as middle powers. Um, because yes, we are losing those anchors, which previously used to be, superpowers. Uh, hopefully only temporarily, but we have to be ready for anything, right? But that's sort of a short view of how I think we should navigate this kind of situation.
So okay, I want to push a little bit on some of those points. They're quite interesting. So I think the first question I would come up with from that discussion is if you could elaborate a bit more, what are the big strategic risks that we face, we as Indonesia,
Mm.
on the global stage? And second, that's what's related to that, is, one of the problems that middle powers have had, whether it's the BRICS organization, is the commonality of productivity and the kind of geoeconomic blocks that the countries depend on. Now, in Indonesia, I've been here for a long time myself. Every president comes in and says Indonesia's foreign policy is to be enemy of none, friend to all, right? And it sort of stems from the non-alignment idea, but it does seem a little dated for a trillion-dollar economy that's the fourth biggest country in the world to be a friend to everybody in such a polarized kind of situation. So perhaps you could talk a little bit more about if it's not non-alignment that should be the cutting edge of Indonesia's policy. What should be the cutting edge? And when you say principles, specifically what kind of principles besides the Boy Scout motto, is be good to people and socially just and helpful. And within that, the last question would be, as a response, is not all partnerships count the same, right? Which ones would you put as being the most important partnerships, and which ones are sort of on the back burner somewhere like you said, on hold for a little while?
Right. Maybe building on my earlier comments, that it's really important to become really clear-minded about what we stand for, right? Just to illustrate on that, what do we stand for? What do we stand for actually, right? Our state ideology, Pancasila, right? We all know that religion or God is the first of our five state ideologies, right? So we are a religious country. That's just a fact. We hold religious values highly, right? Now, I believe, for example, all religions teach that we should consider ourselves custodian of nature, like of all of God's creatures, right? That's just one example of an ethical value or principle that I think we can agree on with many other societies, right? That as human beings, we have a special responsibility to safeguard the environment and all of God's creatures. And you can arrive at that conclusion through the religious route or through the philosophical route, right? But other important principles is honesty, right? Honesty, integrity. That may sound a bit old-fashioned or out of tune in a moment in history where there's so much post-truth and truthiness, as the Americans might call it, right? It's kind of like truthy enough, as opposed to the whole truth and nothing but the truth, right? But more practical versions of the word truth and honesty are just facts, reality, right? And science is rooted in facts and reality, right? There are objective measurements of global temperatures, right? That clearly show a warming trend. There are, studies that show definitively the correlations between our greenhouse gas emissions, right, and rising temperatures. So that's the reality. That's the truth, right? Powerful blocks or powerful people might not agree at the moment, but that is a truth. That is a reality, right? Even as some blocks disagree, other blocks will strongly agree, right? And in fact, have a strong interest. So, for example, there was a fascinating article. Can't remember now whether it's Financial Times or Bloomberg or both, right? Economist magazine. But today, China exports roughly 2 times as much every year as the United States exports in hydrocarbons. Yeah, so I'm a little bit on thin ice here. I can't remember exactly the numbers. I thought U.S. exports something like $100 billion per year in natural gas, refined fuels like diesel, jet fuel, and so on, right? Whereas China exports something like $200 billion per year in solar panels, battery energy storage systems, electric vehicles, and the like, right? Now, that gives China a strong commercial interest to agree in the energy transition, right? To agree that we should all work together to overcome, our carbon emissions and the climate crisis, right? They stand to make a lot of money from exporting more solar panels, more batteries, more wind turbine components. Uh, China makes between 80 to 90% of all the world's solar panels, between 80 and 90% of all the world's batteries, and between 70 and 80% of all the world's wind turbine components, right? And so they're a key part of the solution for our global climate crisis, right? And so that's just a fact. That's a pragmatic win-win if we work with China. I mean, not just we in Indonesia, but countries around the world, right? And we use China's manufacturing prowess, right, to expedite the energy transition towards renewable energy. That's just a win-win. So just an example of a principles-based or principles-oriented, approach to foreign policy and international relations.
Yes, okay, let me push you a little bit on that.
Sure, yeah.
What I was asking about is what's the alternative to the big country, mid-sized country paradigm? What you came back with is China and the United States and their energy contributions. I didn't hear India, Brazil, Mexico, Egypt, all those other countries.
Let me address that.
Yeah, please.
So absolutely. I believe the key is collaborations with the likes of Japan, South Korea, India, the UK, the European Union, and its member countries, Australia, Canada. These are all middle powers, right? And for now, certainly, still overwhelmingly more technocratic or rational, predictable, right? Yes, right-wing movements are rising in popularity in places like the UK and France, and that's something that we need to monitor, right? But for the moment, these are, in my view, the best bet. As dominant as the USA and China are in the global economy and in global trade, uh, the US still accounts for, call it 23% of the world economy. Let's say China accounts for 18 or 19% of the world economy. So together they're 40 something percent, right? 43%. At least the other 56, 57% of the world, right? And that includes the countries I mentioned earlier: Japan, Korea, the EU, Canada, Australia, Indonesia, India. So in the diplomatic jargon, I guess we would move more towards what's called minilateral arrangements, right? So multilateral arrangements among coalitions of the willing, whether the subject is cooperation on renewable energy or cooperation on pandemic threats or biosecurity or environmental issues like microplastics, right, pollution and the like. And this is not going to make the news very much. Part of populist regime strategy, as we know, is what's called flooding the zone. And so noisy populist regimes around the world will continue flooding the news flow with the latest outrage, the latest whatever, right? But I can assure you, because I've been going around the world last few months, like sort of reconnecting with my networks in different countries, and these dialogues between middle powers are really happening. They're really, really happening, right? And it's not all thanks to technocrats and thanks to rational analysis. For example, when Russia invaded Ukraine and Western Europe suddenly found itself short of artillery, suddenly the solution came out of South Korea, right? And so because of the standoff against North Korea, apparently suddenly the world discovered there's more artillery in South Korea. There's more howitzers, right, in South Korea than there's in the entirety of Western Europe. And so initially quietly and eventually openly, right, South Korea is exporting tons of artillery and artillery shells and defense equipment, and to the point where the chairman of this think tank in London that I'm on the board of, the IISS, right, Dr. John Chipman said, South Korea is now clearly part of Europe's security architecture, right? And so it's an example of where middle powers have already started to collaborate. But I can't resist, Professor Guggenheim. You mentioned this principle, 1,000 friends, zero enemies, right? I will state for the record that I disagree with that approach, right? I would say if you have no enemies, probably you have no principles, right? Because as Abraham Lincoln said, uh, you can make some of the people happy all of the time, right? And you can make all of the people happy some of the time, but you will never be able to make all of the people happy all of the time, right? And so if you have principles, right, and you stick by them, you're always going to make somebody unhappy, right? But again, I think as long as it's a coherent paradigm of policy orientations that are rooted in values and principles that you've espoused for consistently over many years, right? People will understand, like, okay, that's Indonesia. That's natural that they say that because that's their character, that's their national character, right? Those are their values.
Let me follow up with grounding this a bit in Indonesia. And as someone who's been here for a fairly long time, one of the things I've been noticing over the past 5 years is the way that Indonesia's gone from a mixed manufacturing and commodities-based economy to one that's increasingly commodities-based. Right? With a little bit of a bet recently under the Jokowi administration that downstream processing will add more value to Indonesia. And there's an economic rationale for that. But a country of 280 million cannot rely only on raw commodities and mining. Every year, there's several million jobs that you need, preferably in manufacturing and sort of higher skilled kinds of jobs. In your view, we're not seeing that. What we're seeing is deindustrialization right now, right? And we have a job crisis. We have a middle class crisis that's developing. And these are long-term slow burns that can explode at any one point. And all the yellow signs, yellow lights are flashing from any economic or political perspective. So if you're to think about the concrete steps of what India needs to do to move from commodity dependence towards higher value manufacturing and services, what's something that would be realistically achievable? So not just big picture visions of, oh yes, we need to diversify the economy, but how do we get within 5 to 10 years into a more mixed kind of economy? And why are our policies not aligned with that kind of goal when we have so many smart economic planners throughout this system? And then the last point, given that you're in Georgetown, is going to be what role should Indonesia's universities and the education system be playing in diversifying the economy to make it more resilient, again, in this multipolar kind of economy?
Thank you, Professor Guggenheim. Um, at the risk of repeating what I already mentioned during the presidential campaign and other opportunities, uh, not only are we deindustrializing, right, but within the industrial sector, most of the government's policy focus has been on what we call capital intensive industry and not labor intensive industry, right? So nickel smelters, even the investments that I helped bring in as BKPM chairman, right? Petrochemical plants, cloud data centers, those are all capital intensive, but not very labor intensive. Even a $3.5 billion petrochemical plant, like the one that just went up in Chilegon, right? Both during construction as well as after construction will not employ a lot of people. And actually, towards the end of the President Jokowi's first term, I wanted to shift our industrial policy focus towards the labor-intensive industries such as garments, footwear, furniture, electronics. Because, especially for example, if you think about furniture industry, as one of the largest tropical forest countries in the world, right, which have a natural advantage cultivating the raw materials for furniture industry, namely our timber, right? So that would seem very, very natural. Why we haven't gone in that direction? I think it's a continuation of the populist politics, right? It's a continuation of the pro-oligarchy policy paradigms, right? So if you look at the actual policies rather than rhetoric, the policies have been strongly oriented towards capital intensive mega projects, right, that benefit owners of capital, not workers, right? Now, another issue I would highlight, and this is a nice segue to cities, right? If we're really, really serious about creating jobs, and you did appropriately mention that we have a jobs crisis, Professor Guggenheim, uh, then we should, if we're serious about job creation, we should be focused on what's called the services sector. Yeah. This is always missing from many politicians' rhetoric, right? They want to cut ribbons on factories, they want to cut ribbons on highways, toll roads, airports, but uh, especially middle class jobs are overwhelmingly in the so-called services sector. And that includes everything from banking and finance, classic middle class job, right? White collar job, working in a bank branch or in a bank's back office and so on. Retailing, service sector, tourism is a service sector. In fact, even better, it's also a services export, right? So people, especially politicians, always talk about merchandise trade. Actually, they always talk about trade surplus, or trade deficit. Uh, Normally, they're talking about what's called the merchandise trade surplus or merchandise trade deficit, right? So we have a big merchandise trade surplus now, like goods. Goods exports are bigger than goods imports. But actually, if you add in trade and services, we have a huge deficit in services. We actually import a lot of services, like insurance services, like we reinsure a lot of our insurance industry's risks to the outside, or we're still importing a lot of financial services, a lot of shipping services, and so on. Right? But uh, service sector is absolutely where the action would be if indeed sincerely our policy priority was job creation. Yeah. I'd like to point out that a big shopping center like the one that's downstairs, Plaza Indonesia, employs as many people as probably 7 to 9 big factories, right? It's probably about 2,000 or 2,500 people working down there, right? Plaza Indonesia 1, 2, and 3. And typical factory would be 300 to 500 people, right? And so, and frankly, service jobs in retailing, in F&B, and tourism are often preferable to middle class workers than factory jobs or extractive industry jobs like working in mining or heavy industry like smelters and the like. So
So now that you brought up cities, and we have so many students from the urban studies class here, right? In Wendy's class, right, one of the things our students have to do is find the most exciting, innovative urban innovation, not from Indonesia, and adapt it to what would it take to make this work in Jakarta. It's a very exciting kind of assignment. So far, the hardest part of this exercise has been to define what is the vision for Jakarta that would explain why this adaptation will make the city more livable. So it seems like we tend to get little bits and pieces. The High Line in New York is interesting, right? The transportation in Singapore is interesting, but it feels like the vision for Jakarta gets made out of borrowed and copied parts, that each one sounds good individually, but they don't really add up to the story of what an organic city is. When I think of Paris, I don't need to think about bits copied from Tokyo or other pieces from Brasilia. And yet, when we talk about the vision for Jakarta, right, we keep arguing about what should it be. So let me ask you that question. If we think about what should Jakarta's core identity be by 2045, should it be a financial hub? Should it be known as a center of innovation? Should it be the cultural capital of Southeast Asia? Should it be something else? Which would be the global cities? Because Jakarta is very obsessed with becoming a global city and a livable city. What should we be benchmarking ourselves against? And which one should we just stop trying to imitate?
right. So I think the way I think about that, Professor Guggenheim, is at several different levels, right? So Jakarta doesn't have to be a hub only for the region or for the world, right? It's also a hub for the country, right? And like one could say there's hubs, and then there are hubs of hubs, right? Now, putting aside national pride and all that, let's just acknowledge that Singapore is a regional hub. It's a hub of hubs, right? I'll give you a very simple, practical example. Indonesia, a lot of people from the provinces, from the regions, will come to Jakarta for medical care, for checkups, for treatment, for surgery, right? Even dentistry. But a lot of people from the ASEAN countries go to Singapore for medical treatment and checkups and what have you, right? And so there's national hubs. So Jakarta is a national hub for all those services, banking, finance, medical treatment, education, uh, entertainment, retail. People from the provinces come here to shop, right, and to enjoy culinary and so on. Uh, and then there's regional hubs like Singapore. People from all around ASEAN come to Singapore for healthcare, medical treatment, banking services, finance, and so on, right? Uh, so I think there's a natural hierarchy, right? Like hubs, like national hubs, regional hubs, like domestic regional hubs, national hubs, and then ASEAN-wide or East Asia-wide hubs. Uh, Now, to your question, what should be Jakarta's identity, right? Like, what will make Jakarta Jakarta, the way it, the way certain things make Paris Paris, right? Uh, the way I think about that is that capital cities tend to be the kind of culmination or extreme showcase for national character, right? So Paris is kind of the extreme version of what French culture is, right? Not only French culture, but French attitude, perhaps. And so likewise, Jakarta would be an extreme version of what Indonesian culture is, right? Of what Indonesian personality is. So what is an Indonesian culture? What is Indonesian personality, right? The first thing that comes to mind is diversity. Like we're an incredibly diverse country. And so I visualize a future uh, where different neighborhoods of Jakarta have very distinct characters. So Kelapa Gading would have very, very different character from, Jaksel. Thank you. Anak Jaksel. And the Anak Jaksel here would have very different character from Menteng or Kuningan, would have very different character again from, certain parts of West Jakarta or North Jakarta, right? So that variety, that diversity, and Singapore has something similar, but it's very engineered, right? It's very designed. Here we have an opportunity for that to be much more organic, to be more authentic. Um, and other examples of our character, right? Uh, I believe that the Indonesian people are among the most good-hearted, kind-hearted people on the planet, right? And so even today, right? Like I get these stories all the time from friends around the world. Like people just say, "Oh, I was in Bali, I was in Jakarta, 2 years ago, and people are just so nice. People are just unbelievably nice. Everybody's smiling, it's like helpful." One person recently said to me, "I was lost in the city. I think I forgot my wallet, and somebody just walked up to me, do you need help? Like, are you lost?" And then that person led this person, in the right direction. And then, another person jumped in. "Oh, are you lost? Or you need help?" Right? People are just so helpful and so friendly and so hospitable, right? And so kind. So uh, different from Paris or New York, which is maybe a bit more harsh and a bit more sharp-edged. No offense. Um, I visualize, Jakarta just being this incredibly warm, good-hearted city, for a megalopolis that could be, all sharp elbows and fast-paced and dynamic and competitive, right? But it's still kind of competition. It's like a friendly competition, right? And then, lastly, I would say Indonesian character is incredibly rich with humor. right? And as we now like to say, nggak ada deh yang bisa ngalahin netizen Indonesia, right? Like nobody can beat Indonesians on social media. Just the humor, right? The originality of that humor, like the creativity, like you know, we're amazing at making people laugh, right? People making people smile, and so I just think it would be not only fun as a city, but funny. It would be just hilarious. Just be a lot of laughter, and I mean, a few years ago we had that organic, very much not engineered phenomenon of was it Chitayam fashion show or something like, people suddenly turned this zebra crossing into a catwalk, right? And that was just hilarious, right? And so I think that's our national character. And I think Jakarta would be the paragon of our national character, which those are three examples, right? Like kind-hearted, good-hearted, warm-hearted, uh, very diverse, very, very diverse, and then very humorous.
Uh, Let me add a fourth one, what I like about Jakarta and Indonesia as a whole, which is also it's a very creative country and a very creative city, whether that's in the arts, whether it's in social media, there's all kinds of invention going on all the time. Now, creativity is something that public policy can have a really big impact on, right? And now, one of the things Anthony, who's in the audience today, pointed out to me is that Jakarta is one of the few cities in the world where you can go from the North Harbor in Kota Tua as a culture center to here as a shopping center. Government is along the line, and at the other end is the business community. So along a horizontal axis, or vertical axis, sorry, right, we have all the elements of a world-class city. Everyone who comes to Indonesia is going to tell you that they love Indonesians, all the reasons that you said, and they hate the traffic, right? So in some ways, part of the solution here has got to be about spatially unifying the city in a way that integrates all these different potential benefits of the city in a way that would maximize the creative potential. Now, that raises the second question I wanted to ask you about Jakarta, which is that when you have growth anywhere, some places really benefit from growth. And you can see that in SJBD, you can see it with formal jobs, the number of registered businesses in the official statistics, but other people get left behind, right? We have informal workers, we have unregistered migrants, we have informal settlements along the various canals. The challenge for urban development and for our students is can you come up with the policies that will stimulate the growth, but not leave big chunks of the population behind, right? What sort of policies do you think would let us reduce spatial inequality and still trigger the kind of growth that Jakarta needs?
Thank you. Uh, so first, I would probably put housing, right? Housing policy. And I do believe the solution would be some variation of Singapore's famously successful HDB program, right? The Housing Development Board. I mean, that program is already decades old and could probably be upgraded to a 21st century version of that, right? But still, there's a lot to be learned from Singapore's HDB program, right? So, government subsidized, uh, vertically oriented, affordable housing uh, around transportation hubs, right? What we famously know as TODs or transit-oriented developments, right? So clusters of tall buildings clustered around public transport uh, would free up space. Uh, Now, that's not only a policy matter, but for example, even a cultural matter, right? So we have to change the public mindset, the public culture to be accepting of living vertically, right? Living in multi-story dwellings and sharing communal facilities like multi-purpose function rooms, you know, swimming pools or other facilities, right? I'm also aware that there's problems with building management. Yeah. So there's an imperfect, maybe even flawed regulatory structure in place that uh, doesn't align building managements with the interests of the tenants in many, many cases. Yeah. And so you have bad building management, and that ruins our reputation of multi-story dwellings in the eyes of a lot of consumers, right? So those things have to be fixed. But going vertical is clearly an imperative, not only for Jakarta, but frankly for Indonesia. As my political partner, Pak Anies Baswedan, always points out, right? Indonesia is not a continental country, right? So we don't have vast amounts of land the way the USA does, or even China or India does, right? We're an archipelago country, and so we have even less land, uh, and so we have to be even more efficient in the way we use land, right? And uh, one stunning illustration, right? Like Singapore is one of the most livable cities in the world. Um, Apparently, only about 40 to 50% of Singapore's surface is actually built on, actually built up the environment. The rest is actually greenery, right? Uh, but if the world's entire 8 billion population of humans lived in urban conditions like Singapore, then all of us would fit into an area the size of South Africa, right? And so it shows you what going vertical can achieve, right? And that would free up planetary surface area for farmland, for nature, right? You have to do a significant amount of rewilding, right, to allow nature to take back a lot of the planet's surface, right? Now, other things uh, I would really emphasize cleanliness, just making the city clean, right? And again, it's not only a policy issue, it's a technological issue, it's also a cultural issue, it's so many issues, right? But I remember the beginnings of Singapore's success in 1970s, 1980s, started to appear when Westerners would come to Singapore, which then was still a surprisingly poor country, right? 1970s, 1980s, something about. And people were just stunned by how clean the city was. Everybody went home to Europe, went home to US, went home to wherever and said, the Singapore place is amazing. It's so clean, right? Now, 10, 20 years ago, when admittedly controversial president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, wanted to emulate Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, the first thing he did was he made Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, apparently shockingly clean, stunningly clean, right? And again, it projects a very different kind of image to the world if your capital city is clean, right? Now, there's so many social reasons to clean up the city, like disease, civilizational reasons to promote clean living and being clean and being disciplined, sorting your garbage, composting or organic waste and so on. Yeah, but slowly or quickly, we do have to clean up the city. We have to get a lot cleaner as a city, as a society, nationwide. Lastly, the good news is there's so many technologies on the horizon. And actually, I would argue, again, thanks to China's manufacturing prowess, right? Now, definitely affordable, that will help massively in our efforts to clean up the city and also to debottleneck public transport. Give you two examples, right? The first is miniaturization and modularization. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. One essential urban infrastructure, sewage treatment plants. Traditionally, we think of them as huge plants costing hundreds of millions of dollars, centralized, right? Fed by many kilometers of collection pipes and transmission pipes, right? Carrying sewage from all over the city to a central location where it's processed, right? But if you think about miniaturization, right? I mean, phones, our smartphone is like the miniaturization of our laptops, our computers, our cameras, our MP3 players, or our portable DVD players. Right? Everything gets miniaturized into a smartphone, right? So uh, you can now actually build district level sewage treatment plants. You don't lose as much in scale economies, downscaling from the very large, centralized sewage treatment plants down to smaller scale ones, right? You don't lose scale economies the way you used to, right? The key then, same as with HDB, is standardization. They all have to be the same. Like just churn them out. It's like a photocopier. And they're all like the same. Don't make them each bespoke, right? Then you get scale economies. An extreme case like this, right? I believe technologies are available now. You could even have a building by building sewage treatment plant, right? So before any building even discharges sewage, it's already treated. Even more extreme, right? There's research and innovation in the world where sewage gets treated at the toilet level, or at the per residence level, right? Again, there's so many new material science, so many new catalysts, so many bioreactor type, innovations to make it possible. So, and that leads to a very decentralized system, right? So rather than huge centralized plants, like more decentralized, more miniaturized, more modularized, and more spread out, right? The same will happen with our electricity grid. It'll be much more modularized, more decentralized, right? Now, the other innovation, I believe aerial drones will be for the 2030s what smartphones were for the 2010s. Yeah. And we have some soul searching to do. We have some public consultation to do. Like, how do we want to do this, right? Uh, you have beautiful views of Sudirman and Tamrin here. Like, would you be happy if 10 years from now, like, the airspace above Sudirman, Tamrin is full of drones, buzzing back and forth? Absolutely. But uh, most of these drones are electric, right? They have batteries and use propellers, whether they're quadcopters or more airplane-like. But I do believe drones will play a major role in delivery of goods. And you know, imagine that. So for now, my policy paradigm would be to allow corridors for drones above existing highways or existing roads, right? So what do you call it, joint protocol or major roads. So all the drones have to fly along those corridors. So we don't let them fly all over the place, yeah. Uh, but that would have an effect like building multiple stories on top of the existing highways, right? So you could have layer one, layer two, layer three, right? And it would be different layers along which drone corridors would operate, right? But it would take a lot of trucks off the road. It would take a lot of delivery vehicles off the road, right? It'd be very, very different. And again, it's a miniaturization, right? Like, uh, it won't be massive containers or big box trucks and whatever. It'll be much more atomized. It'll be much more. But this is how eventually will. This is an example of technology which I believe will help debottleneck traffic jams, for example.
Oh, well, good. So, as someone who comes from the city known for its pizza rats, right? Let me say how much I completely agree with your emphasis on cleanliness. And also, I like what you talked about very much on miniaturization and standardization. I'd like to push back a little bit on the verticalization of Jakarta, if that's okay. When I think about the cities that I find most interesting, right, they're going to be, I compare Beijing to Tokyo. Beijing is very vertical. It has no soul, right? You cited Singapore a lot, but I'd rather be in Jakarta than in Singapore. And one reason I'd rather be in Jakarta is I really enjoy walking through the kampongs and seeing kampong life that disappears when everyone's starting to live in vertical housing complex. And I think there are ways to reconcile the need, and you are right that transport is the key for this, to keep the community culture of the city going and not turn everybody into an individualized household living in a vertical column. The third reason why I'd be a little skeptical on some of the verticalization questions ties into my last question, because I know everybody is dying to ask you questions. And it's as follows, right? A truly global city like Singapore, New York, or London is defined by a predictable legal environment just as much as by an actual skyline. And yet, your own experience with what people have called a criminalization of competence, right, highlights a really bad risk for Indonesia's reformers. And that feeling's pretty tangible. I talk to our students, my fellow colleagues. There's an element of fear right now that even though we all think that the Indonesian public sector needs young reformers who have technocratic skills, there's a fear that if they stay in the public sphere, they're going to end up in jail. right? And so the question actually is right, is when we think about Jakarta's future
Was
as
a
a
little
global
accident there?
hub, yeah, what kind of guardrails does Indonesia to be producing so that technocrats feel safe, not just joining their daddy's conglomerate, but getting into the public spheres to make the kind of economic and administrative reforms that you would need for any of the reforms that you've been talking about all afternoon, right? And I think if you look around this room, I'm not the only one who worries about this. I think they all worry about it, right? So it'd be very helpful, given your own personal experience, right? What would you advise by way of public policy and public reform that will actually start drawing people back? And I just want to add one footnote to that. Last year, I gave a talk at Harvard in New York and in Boston, and there were 8 LPDP students studying S2 and S3. Not one wants to come back, right? All of them, all 8 said, right, it's not worth it. It's not worth the risk when they can get professional scientific careers other places. This is as big a warning sign for Indonesia as anything in the stock market, right? So I'd really like to get both your perspective and your advice, and then we're going to open it up for questions.
Thank you. So first, if you don't mind, I have to put on screen some advertising,
Okay, go ahead.
right? For some product placement. So first, I need to give credit where credit is due, and need to acknowledge to all of you that much of what I learn and stay on top of urban policy issues comes from our think tank called the Karsa City Labs, right? So if you can put that on screen, but so you know,
Great.
so hopefully this name will be familiar to you over the coming years, because this is Pak Anies is in my platform, right? And the managing director or CEO of the think tank is here, Mas Edi Wijaya. But Carson City Labs is where I learn all this stuff or test my ideas, or where ideas that pass the test get proposed to actual city governments, including Jakarta and others around the country. Uh, with that out of the way, uh, uh, you're so right, Professor Guggenheim. I don't envision Jakarta becoming a soulless forest of skyscrapers, right? And actually, you highlight an important nuance, which is that verticalization does not automatically mean 30-story and 40-story skyscrapers, right? In fact, and I kind of hate this because I love skyscrapers, but I read a study that apparently the optimal building height for most cities around the world is 6 to 7 stories. Yeah. So if you go to the downtowns of most European cities, London, Paris, Berlin, you name it, it's hugely dominated by 6 or 7 story buildings. I think Washington, D.C., I was just there a few weeks ago, is dominated by 10-story buildings.
Yeah.
Got it. And apparently that's plenty of density. Like you don't need the skyscrapers actually. In fact, in many cases, skyscrapers are uneconomical, right? Uh, Costs go up exponentially as you go up, right? Uh, but I still think there's a role for them to play, skyscrapers and high rises. And there are going to be certain parts of the city where it makes sense to have 30, 40, and even 50-story skyscrapers, right? Uh, but no, you're right. So uh, what you're also highlighting, or leading me to highlight, the Guggenheim, is the all-important term called street life. Street life, right? Street level, street level life, street life. And what comes to mind, in contrast to Beijing, is Seoul, Korea, where a lot of the slums have become trendy cafes and bike shops and fashion boutiques, or quirky stores, right? And culinary, like restaurants and the like, right? And it's lovely walking around many neighborhoods in Korea, right? In Seoul, particularly. And there's even many parts of Shanghai which are still like that, right? So absolutely, that's why one dilemma is trying to get the right balance between the sort of top-down planning, right? And planning new CBDs and planning skyscrapers and virtualizations and TODs versus allowing enough grassroots movement to and freedom for people in the kampongs, right? Even in the slums to do something with their space, right? So absolutely, and that's what gives the city character. So street life and street level life.
I can add one comment about
Please, yeah.
You've hit my favorite hobby horse, right? Which is that Indonesia has the highest endowments of social capital of any country on the planet,
Right,
right? It has more social capital than it has nickel,
right.
right? And yet, when we start talking to development planners, development economists, they see it as something that's in the way, right? When people say, "Let's build skyscrapers," or "Let's regulate," let's find ways to replace the systems that exist. Instead of using villages' own user associations, they constantly want to make new cooperatives and new associations. What's it going to take to get planners to recognize that the biggest endowment in this country is the social capital that's available for development today?
Right, right. So all these things fit together, right? Even your earlier question about rule of law and risks of criminalization, and how do we attract our talent back from overseas and the like, right? Uh, One important part of the answer to the question is reform of the bureaucracy, right? And actually, it'll require a lot of skillful political communication, right? But actually, our bureaucracy is overloaded doing unproductive things, doing nonsense stuff, right? At the whims of ministers, at the whims of presidents and vice presidents, right? It's a lot of unproductive, nonsensical stuff.
I think you'd enjoy a book by David Graeber, an anthropologist, called Bullshit Jobs. Sums it up in the title. You don't have to read the book.
So, uh, one of my reform visions is to cut down drastically on this nonsense stuff that we're burdening our bureaucrats with, right? So they don't have to work late nights doing this nonsense stuff, right? Let's apply the famous McKinsey 80-20 rule, right? Like, let's focus on the 20% of issues that actually generate 80% of the value, right? That applies across industries and sectors and organizations, right? Prioritization. Uh, that will improve working conditions for the bureaucrats and make the productive goals easier to achieve, right? Um, it's unavoidable that eventually we land on the need for political reforms. Absolutely unavoidable. We now understand, and hopefully these few years are an expensive lesson for the people of Indonesia, right? Of what happens when we allow our politics, to go to shambles. And so we have to have political reforms. We now understand that politicians run the show, and so who we elect has a vast impact on living conditions for years thereafter, right after elections. Um, I'm optimistic. Optimistic. I always remind people that human beings have a natural tendency to think in linear terms, right? When in reality, life and the world uh, goes in cycles, right? Cycles. And just like the stock market doesn't only go up, it also goes down, right? And good investors invest on a forward-looking basis, right? So, if stock market's been going up, you don't see that as a sign to invest more. You see that as a sign to start selling, right? Whereas if the stock market is going down, you don't see it as a sign to keep selling. At some point, it's time to buy, right? Because it's been going down, right? And so, but it's so hard. It's so hard for humans to do that, right? Humans want social acceptance, right? So they love being in a crowd, right? So the crowd, the herd mentality, right? Like, oh, stocks are going up, everybody's buying. Well, I want to buy, right? Stocks are down. It was like so depressed, like I'm selling, right? That's actually the worst time to sell. Uh, and so I will go as far as to say, Professor Guggenheim, Professor Tajima, that we might be nearing the climax of the populist moment around the world, right? Like this might be, I think the populist bubble is about to burst. Um, and I think the pendulum will swing. And when it does, you're going to get this breath of fresh air, right? Because suddenly, the voters put technocrats back on top, right? Put technocrats back in these jobs. You suddenly have all this rational policy, or at least starting with rational, sensible, and coherent discussion, rooted in reality and facts, right? As opposed to whatever we have now. And just like right now, not only us, but many countries around the world have been in a vicious cycle, right? Uh, when the pendulum swings, when the cycle turns, we do go into virtuous circle, right? And it's a long discussion. I warned you before that one of my challenges is being concise. I'm not a very concise person, very talkative. But uh, but so it's a longer discussion. The various signs that I see, like that, to me indicate we're nearing the peak. Peak populism, peak pencitraan, like peak performative politics, and the pendulum is about to swing back towards rational policy, technocratic approaches, and so on. Yeah, but I do believe we're nearing that point.
We can always pray. Right. Well, thanks very much for really an excellent discussion so far. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and let me put a few guidelines, if that's okay. We'd like to take 3 questions at a time so that you have time to think about it as people ask. And then unless somebody from the audience, maybe Wendy, if you see people raising their hand on the screen, I can't see it from here. So let's take 3 from the audience here and then move to the screens. Would anyone like to ask the first question? Jim?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Scott and Tom, for just a very informative hour. We appreciate it very much. And your very last point on social capital that already exists in Indonesia, it seems like the best way to protect and encourage social capital is decentralization. And right now we have a struggle on decentralization, currently focused around the elections and whether or not we want direct local elections and so on. But we see the central government is so intrusive and so powerful that I think that's one, in my personal opinion, that's one of the reasons we see the undermining of social capital, and we see perhaps well-intentioned bureaucrats from outside always come in and try and have a solution for local problems and so on, and we don't take advantage of the social capital that exists. I mean, I'll stop there in the interest of time, but I just would love to hear your comments on that.
Okay, so I want to ask a little bit about the future. What do you think a city like? Oh, sorry, my name is Mega from the regional Mega.
Mega.
From the Bapeda Jakarta. So what do you think a city like Jakarta should prepare to face the aging population era after the demographic bonus ends in maybe 20, 30 years from now, as people live longer and birth rates declines, maybe from infrastructure and economic wise? Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Putri from Jakarta Provincial Health Office. The past few years, we see that so many policies went viral, and then there's people resist on that, and then the government changed it. And we at local government, we have Musrembang, Musyawarah Perencanaan dan Pembangunan, and also complaint handling service. But I would like to ask your point of view about how to create policies that ensure the people's participation is meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you. So first, let me throw in my lot with you, Jim. I'm a huge believer in decentralization, right? And what I always emphasize is that decentralization is a form of delegation. It's a form of delegation of powers. Now, if we take the analogy of like a family business or any business, any company, right? Imagine two contrasting organizations. One where the CEO hates to delegate, like he or she just wants to do everything, right? Or decide everything. Like how efficient or how effective will that organization be? Versus an organization where the CEO delegates a lot, right? To be safe, to be extra safe, I won't mention names, right? When I was at PKPM, a friend came by and he's a CEO of a top 20 global company, top 20 global market cap company, a famous brand that all of us use certainly every month, right? And but then he was already into his ninth or 10th year as global CEO, right? And I asked him, and his share price had gone up sevenfold, eightfold in that period. And I asked him, what's the secret of your success? And he said, very simple, Tom, just one thing: decentralization and delegation. We used to run everything out of New York. Like everything used to have to go to New York for approval. We stopped that. We empowered the regional hubs. And then we asked the regional hubs to empower the local teams, trust them, right? But as President Ronald Reagan used to say, right, like trust but verify, right? So focus on holding people accountable, right? Or Defense Secretary Robert Gates once said, don't micromanage, but ask micro questions. It's one of Pa Anis's favorite quotes here. So be interested, like understand the detail, but leave the detail to the people closest to the action, right? And decentralization does that at a national scale, right? So it's really, really important. All I can say concisely, Jim, is that the pendulum swings, right? Anything taken to an extreme, such as the centralization of powers we see right now, will eventually burn itself out. I would argue it's already burning itself out. It's causing so much problems for itself. It's causing so much problems for the central government. And at some point, it just cracks. It just breaks. I mean, we've been around long enough, right, Jim, to have witnessed that a number of times where a model, an approach, just goes bankrupt. It's basically run its course, right, and gone beyond the point where it's still working, and in fact, this has become counterproductive. And as one economist famously said, when something cannot continue, it'll stop, right? Sorry, again, don't know how to answer that concisely any other way. Mega, aging population, right? So it's interesting, right? At the risk of sounding cliched, any problem is actually an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to provide solution. And aging societies create what's called the silver economy, right? There's so many opportunities to serve aging populations and retirees, actually, right? Now, not everybody is a rich retiree, but again, to reiterate that famous McKinsey 80-20 rule, yeah? So the 20% richest elderly will generate 80% of the value by spending, right? Or at least the profits in that silver economy. So, like it or not, a lot of our economies cater to that 20%, right? We make our living off that. And how does Jakarta think about, how would Jakarta provincial government think about that, right? This may be, would relate to Mbak Putri's question, right? How do we ensure public consultation, right? Public participation. the best ideas indeed come bottom up. They don't come top down, right? If you think about an organizational pyramid where there's a singular CEO, say the governor at the top, she or he will be vastly outnumbered by the bottom of the pyramid, right? And so the advent of the internet saw the explosion of this phenomenon called crowdsourcing. Yeah. I won't go off on a tangent on that, right? But open public consultation is easier than ever, right? And collecting ideas is easier than ever. I mean, I could come up, I could share a number of ideas on how to navigate, but also capitalize on the silver economy at the same time, right? Uh, uh, but but I believe cities are actually great places for retirees and for elderly people. You know, there's a saying that you'll never get lonely in New York City, right? Like you just go downstairs and you walk the streets and it's crowded and dynamic and there's street musicians and street performers. There's always something going on, right? So uh, we'd have to get quite granular, yeah. Like, for example, caregivers, right? Probably will suffer the same challenges as ojek drivers, right? I mean, dominated by informal arrangements. There's no work contract. There's no social insurance. There's all these things, right? So I think the solution is the same in many ways, So I think we hear a lot the saying that you want to fix education, you have to fix the teachers, right? You have to give teachers proper salary, you have to give them proper pensions, and so on, right? And so the education system rests on teachers and headmasters. And so likewise, the elder care industry rests on the caregivers, right? And so anything that's helpful to caregivers, and that is the same as what's helpful to others, in other sectors, reliable and cheap public transport, affordable housing, proper pensions, proper health insurance, all these things, right? But with a particular focus on caregivers for elderly, right? But yeah, the policy formulation process right now, right? Again, it's very top down. It's very, whimsical, dare I say, quite impulsive, and for some time has been moving further and further away from open public consultation. And if you think about it, right, like if you're a bureaucrat or you're a elected leader, contrast or imagine two contrasting approaches. One is you're trying to come up with all the solutions all on your own. You're trying to kuras otak ya. You're trying to be brilliant, right? And okay, for this the solution is ABC. For that the solution is X, Y, Z, right? And then you're ordering people, okay, do this, do this, do this. Right? Imagine the other approach, right? You just sit back. You sit back. You open space for dialogue and even debate, right? You delegate. It's like you give people the freedom. You empower them to just go ahead and do, even experiment, and you absolve them of failures, right? And suddenly you no longer have to work 18, 19-hour work weeks. You're working 40, 50-hour work weeks, right? Like holding people accountable, making sure that systems are transparent, like that everything is made transparent. Everything, both successes and failures are documented and published with no prejudice to the failures, right? Like in many respects, failures should be celebrated, right? In Silicon Valley, they certainly are, right? But that's the kind of cultural change that I believe would turn things around, right? Uh, uh, you can ask my colleagues in Ministry of Trade or BKPM during my time there, and they're always amazed. Like they said, in 1 year that I was at Trade Ministry, in 3 years I was at BKPM, never once did I yell at people. Never once did I lose my temper and like marah-marahin orang, yeah, like never once. And I always give people the assurance, like, look, uh, I will never penalize you for making mistakes. If you're not making mistakes, most likely you're not making decisions because human beings make mistakes, right? And to insist otherwise is sinful because only God makes no mistakes, right? And so, unless we want to pretend to be God who makes no mistakes, right, then it's completely irrational, nonsensical to insist that your staff makes no mistakes, right? So if they're not making mistakes, means they're not doing anything. They're not making decisions, right? And again, sorry to be a bit verbose, but in my experience, time and again, a wrong decision is better than no decision. We can share many war stories that illustrate that reality, but it's better to make a decision. If it's not optimal, fix it, right? And then iterate, right? Just keep improving that decision over time as new data comes in and as conditions evolve, right? But, you know, paralysis by analysis or paralysis due to lack of empowerment delegation, lack of trust, right? That's the worst. But yeah, I mean, someday we will have leaders who respect the public's opinion, respects the public's creativity and imagination and social capital, right? And provides that forum, provides that room for debate, discussion, criticism, right? Humor, uh, comedy, and is willing to delegate power and authority, right? That's what empowering, memberdayakan, right? Like a lot of our politicians, a lot of us politicians like to use this phrase memberdayakan, was UMKM, small businesses or whatever, memberdayakan, whatever, but we don't often understand what that actually means. That means giving up authority or giving up power to various layers below you, trusting them, right? But insisting on systems that hold people accountable, right? Again, without prejudice to failures, right? Which will take time, but again, I'm optimistic that we're at a turning point soon.
Okay, can we take that?
Can you scroll down, Bun? Bisa kebaca atas. Itu.
Here? Okay.
Who's controlling the screen?
Wizard of Oz over there.
Behind the curtain, right?
There's one.
Ah, there we go.
There's one from Astrid.
No, we can.
Okay, I'll read from here. Okay.
So this. Dari sini Bu.
From Astrid. Greetings. My name is Astrid from Indonesia Defense University. My question is from your perspectives. Cities should be engines of economy. However, if a city grows, while the law is used to create fear and protecting our citizens, in parentheses, impunity, is that city truly competitive? Or is it just a shiny display that hides a broken democracy? How can our cities and economy eventually grow? Okay. So law and order and impunity of law enforcement agencies and others, right? And competitiveness of cities and how that competitiveness can drive economic development, right? So I think most reasonable people can agree that the condition today has become far too repressive, right? And certainty of law has declined massively, considerably, right? Frankly, it's commonplace among the business community to say that literally the phrase is nobody's safe. Nobody's safe, right? Like so many people are being arrested. So many people are being threatened with arrest. Now people are being hit with fines and penalties, even confiscation and expropriation, and peaceful protesters are being jailed, being given jail sentences just for reposting or uploading comments or videos or photos on social media, right? So again, I think whilst we're far from being the most repressive country in the world, right? But relative to what we were 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago, right? Conditions are far more repressive today. And it's a big problem. It's an absolutely big problem. Sorry, I'm violating your rule. We're supposed to be aggregating 3 questions at a time. I'm answering this one first here. But I think another challenge in political communication for us progressive politicians, reformist Democrats, is to explain in simple street level language the linkage between democracy and prosperity, right? Like, why do we need democracy? Like, all I care about is prosperity, right? But again, to give you an example, if you look at every country in the world, the vast majority of countries that are prosperous and inclusively so, yeah, everybody in a society is prosperous and sustainably so already for many, many years, and the outlook is good. They'll continue to be prosperous, like broadly prosperous. Everybody's prosperous, yeah, for years to come. Like virtually all of them are democracies. Right? Virtually none of them is a authoritarian regime. Now, the examples that are always held up are the likes of China and Vietnam, right? And China's always held up, or authoritarian Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, right? Well, first, let me say that the 1970s, the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, that Lee Kuan Yew was governing under was a very different kind of geopolitical and political situation, technological situation compared to what we have today, right? And so the things that were relevant and applicable 1970s, 1980s, 1990s are just not relevant or applicable today. The world's very, very different today from the time of Lee Kuan Yew, right? So it's very dangerous to say, oh, let's rule any country the way it was ruled elsewhere in the 1970s, right? Secondly, let's take China, right? As far as I can read the statistics, yeah, it probably has a middle class of about 300 million people out of a population of 1.5 billion people. Yeah, so 20%. This might risk veering into a bit of a subjective assessment, right? But you take any country like the Scandinavian countries or the Western European countries or North American countries, I would argue in those societies, the middle class is like the middle 50%, right? I mean, I know there's econometric definitions that would argue against me, right? They say, oh, no, we've got these income levels and so on. But truly, I believe that in China, about 20% would be considered middle class. But the implication is that, and then maybe 5% is the rich, right? The upper classes. But at least 75% of people who are actually in the lower income bracket. Yeah. And people forget that. I mean, we see the shiny cities of Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, even Chongqing, and then you go to second tier cities like Hefei or Hangzhou, and you're amazed. This is a second tier city. It looks amazing, right? But we forget, so 20% of 1.5 billion people is 300 million people. That's almost the entire population of the USA, right? So even 300 million middle class is a massive economy all by itself, right? But it leads us to forget that there's another 75% of the Chinese public that's actually living in surprisingly low income kind of conditions, right? And so I think China is very successful in many respects, and I respect that, right? I'm not trying to deny that, right? But is it leading to broadly inclusive prosperity that will be sustainable on a multi-year basis, right? I think the jury's still out at a minimum, right? Vietnam, same thing, right? again, history strongly shows, right, that virtually all countries that get to the holy grail of like broadly inclusive prosperity that's sustainable decade after decade after decade are all electoral democracies. Yeah? And there's almost no authoritarian regimes. Now, there's some rich petrostates like Abu Dhabi, Qatar, which are monarchies, right? There's no elections there. But again, those are special cases, in my view. And we don't, use outliers to extrapolate lessons for the rest of the bell curve, yeah, for the sort of normal countries. This is Len Newman's question. Right, right. Okay, this is Len Newman. This is not about cities, really, but the current moment in Indonesia with the fall in the IDX. After MSCI spoke out about market governance, suddenly we are talking about booking stocks. I think Sam Gorengan, right, is what he's referring to. But this has gone on for decades and nobody did anything about it. Why would MSCI or anyone believe the current promises will be kept, right? So it certainly is true that these problems in governance over listed stocks has been going on for many, many years. Right? I mean, most of the conglomerate affiliated companies whose share prices or whose share movements are most suspect IPO during the previous government's term, right? Number one. Also, not all of these stocks are necessarily conglomerate stocks, right? If you remember, there was technology stocks that also IPO'd at massive valuations, soared for a while, then crashed. There was a bunch of digital banks that reached absurd valuations before also crashing, right? So, of course, Lynn is absolutely correct that this problem has been going on for some time, right? Why now? Why now? I think over the past year and a half, we've seen a rapid deterioration in what I would call our macroeconomic credibility, right? And when credibility starts to run thin, the tolerance or patience of rating agencies or global analysts becomes less, right? So if you're highly credible, right? If you've been truthful and honest, and through that you build up credibility over many years or decades, they will cut you a lot more slack. They will believe that you will solve these problems, right? But over the last year and a half, I would say that's been going into reverse, right? Like our credibility has been declining, and that will reduce the tolerance of the likes of MSCI or S&P or Moody's, Fitch, right? To give us room, right? To give us tolerance to fix these problems over time, right? So now they say you fix it by May or else, right? Maybe I'll stop there to give others an opportunity if we still have time. Yeah.
No way we're letting you go without talking about Competitiveness.
Oh, Patatua, right. Sure. So thank you, first of all, for alerting me that this will be a question. So I've had a couple of days to think about it, right? Patatua. So I started thinking of comparable situations or case studies such as Barcelona, Amsterdam, and extreme case, Venice. Right? Venice is really, really extreme. It's an island. It's a sinking island. It's not expandable, right? And in fact, the population of Venice went down from the local inhabitant population of Venice, like people of Venice actually live in Venice, right? Went down from 175,000 in 1975 to around 50,000 today. Yeah, but there are still local Venetians who live in Venice, right? But what's happened there? Without policy intervention, that 50,000 would be zero. I mean, real estate in Venice would be so expensive, right? A less extreme version of that plays out in places like Barcelona or Amsterdam. Probably Professor Guggenheim, Professor Tajima, you know better, but from my understanding, it is heavy policy intervention, right? So from what I understand, Barcelona, for example, and also Amsterdam have high degrees of what's called social housing. It's so heavily subsidized by government, uh, pulling every trick in the playbook to find a way to get sufficient volume of affordable housing into city centers, including into historic districts, right? Now, again, as usual, it's not a single magic bullet. It's a multidimensional approach, right? So number one is that you address the housing in favor of local inhabitants, right? And that doesn't always have to mean building 4-story, 5-story social housing. People move there. Absolutely, Professor Guggenheim. It can mean helping kampong people renovate, subsidizing own renovations, right? So they can renovate, improve, right? Add facilities like garbage disposal and neighborhood level or district level sewage treatment or other things, right? Greenery, right? So you need a balanced approach, like a mix of policies, right? Some top down, some bottom up, right? Some just giving again freedom and room for people at the grassroots level to experiment, to do what they think is best, what they want to do, right? But even like this, I apparently, from what I read, a lot of the people who live in those historic districts of Amsterdam work in the museums, work in the galleries, work in the cafes, work in the antique stores or the comic book stores, the quirky stores that will spring up, right? And so uh, my impression is it's also a matter of job matching, right? So it's communicating to the residents there, what are the jobs in that area, and then trying what policymakers do, right? Like training programs, upskilling, physical subsidies, right? To enable those people to qualify to work in museums, to work in galleries, to work, as tour guides and so on, right? Um, and I think again, places like Barcelona, Amsterdam, Venice, in different ways and to varying degrees, of success, illustrate how it can be done. But I'm very optimistic. Um, Again, there's no one size fits all or single magic bullet. So I think, plenty of people will still commute into jobs in Kota Tua, which is why public transport links are so important, right? But yeah, I mean, I think uh, there are uh, social reasons to preserve local communities. Uh, there's also a moral imperative, right? So Pak Anies, when he was governor of Jakarta, uh, and Mas Dedi and others, Mas Will can speak in more detail to this, but I understand he implemented a policy uh, excluding war veterans and others who inherited their houses in places like Menteng from property tax, right? So these are, war veterans or families of legendary ministers in the past got their houses in Menteng when Menteng was nowhere near as expensive as it is today, right? And given property taxes and given property values, like there's no way they can afford to stay, right? But Anis specifically exempted them from property tax so that they can stay, right? And in many cases, these kinds of families are like living museums, right? I think one thing we also need to address over time is policymakers, and as a result, our society currently doesn't sufficiently value history. I mean, history is phenomenal. I mean, it's so much fun. It's so inspiring and enlightening. And many or most of us have heard this saying, right? Those who ignore history are doomed to repeat. Like those who ignore the lessons of history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of history, right? And so learning from history is so important. But so yeah, there's many social as well as moral as well as practical reasons we should have a healthy blend of policies that preserve local communities and local inhabitants up to a point, of course, right?
Take one more round. Yuki, then in the back. You're over there. So Yuki first.
Thank you so much, Tom. This has been a really great discussion. I wanted to touch on an area that hasn't been talked about too much, but is definitely in your area of expertise, which is industrial policy. Given that you were the Minister of Investment and Downstream, which I view as really the engine of industrial policy in Indonesia. So it's really a question about downstream, which to my mind is really about how do you transition the Indonesian economy to higher value-added sectors, right? And I'm a believer in industrial policy, looking at the history of South Korea, of Japan, Taiwan. But the trick, of course, is about how you choose the right sectors, right? And you don't know which sectors actually make sense until you've really tried it. To your point, making mistakes is part of it, right? But when I think about downstreaming here in Indonesia, I feel like there's another point of yours, which is too much linear thinking, right? Just in general, right? Which comes to the idea, I mean, so we have a very active critical minerals research agenda here, and there is the policy of banning the export of raw materials, right? And I feel like there's a sort of linear progression from raw materials to semi-processed to processed, and then it'll go down to the finished goods, right? But that works in the case of nickel, right? Because nickel, you have certain value added that you get from nickel processing here. But in other sort of metals like copper or whatnot, where you have an overcapacity in China and other places, actually, you can just send it to China and they can process it basically at cost almost, right? Because they just have too much. So I agree with the goal of downstreaming as much as possible because that's where you get the higher value added. But why not send it out and then bring it back, right? So you choose the right places where the value added is highest, right? So I wonder, why is it the case that there is this kind of commitment to the linear process, right? Because if you have the blanket sort of ban, then you're forcing everyone, like in every single mineral, to go downstream. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Aditya. I'm actually a general surgery resident, but I would like to ask two questions. First, I'm interested in how you say that the Jakarta is still finding its identity. So, meanwhile, in the time that Jakarta is finding its identity, changing slogan, etc., the other city is copying Jakarta. So, like in Indonesia, guru kencing berdiri, murid kencing berlari. So the result is pretty comical, such as in Madiun, you can go from mini Eiffel to mini Arc de Triomphe and then to mini Ka'bah, and then eating at mini Transjakarta shelter at the very same city. How we should disillusionize these leaders so that they have to tailor the identity of a city by themselves, not by copying others. And the second question, perhaps a little bit short, in this era when the city budget got choked by the free lunch, how how should the city could be more creative in finding tax because for example in LA you can have a measure that adds tax so that they can fund their public transport. There's no such instrument here in Indonesia, and how would you do you think it should be? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Floresita. So
Sorry,
you mentioned about
Florencita?
Floresita.
Floresita.
Yeah.
Floresita.
So you
Beautiful
mentioned
name.
about social capital, and given Indonesia of semangat gotong royong, which we can consider it as one of the foundation of a social capital. How can we mainstream like volunteerism as skills to enhance, like urban livability and economic competitiveness, or just enabling meaningful support for government efforts to improve the city, or maybe like fostering energy synergy among private sector, public governance, civil society, and citizens. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for all these great questions. So, Professor Tajima, on industrial policy. Like you, I also believe in industrial policy. I'll give you an example. I was in Korea a few months ago, and the Korean chemicals industry is getting battered, by a flood of chemical exports from China, right? And the Korean government convened all the chemicals companies in Korea who all hate each other. They are fierce competitors. Effectively, they're very competitive against each other, right? And set them all down. And I guess the battering is so bad, right? Like prices are plummeting. Like China is flooding the world with these commodity chemicals, right? Even the chemical companies who normally hate each other finally agree to sit down, and they're all trying to naik kelas. They're all trying to go to specialty chemicals, right? Not commodity chemicals, but it wouldn't make sense for all of them to go into the same specialty chemicals, right? So they have to come to an arrangement. You do this one, I'll do this one, you'll do that one, right? And it's not collusion, it's coordination, right? What's the difference? This should all take place in a transparent fashion, open to the public, right? And so not in smoky back rooms, right? In opaque ways, backroom dealings and whatever. And underpinned again by data and reality, right? Like, what are you talking about? You're going to do that sort of chemical. You have no experience in that, right? Like you have no experience in like agricultural chemicals. Like doesn't make any sense, right? So there needs to be a debate, a coordination rooted still in realities and facts and data. But it's an example of good industrial policy. So you're absolutely correct. In actuality, there's absolutely no connection between the upstream industries and the downstream industries, none whatsoever. So many countries that have very successful downstream industries have no upstream industry whatsoever, right? No smelters, no refineries even, right? Think about some of the richest countries in the world, Singapore, Switzerland. They have no smelters. They have no refineries, like oil refineries, right? And yet, for example, Switzerland has one of the most successful pharmaceutical industries in the world, but they have no upstream petrochemicals to speak of. They have no upstream oil refineries, even though a lot of pharmaceutical products actually have a lot of petrochemical inputs here, raw material inputs. So the fact of the matter is, experience in the field shows there's no connection whatsoever between a successful downstream and an upstream, right? Why did we get on this whole hilirisasi downstreaming rhetoric, right? Well, it's a classic populist playbook of politicians going to the public with not only a simple narrative, but a single narrative, right? Keep hammering this one word, downstreaming, downstreaming, and downstreaming, and say it's a solution for everything. That is the classic populist playbook, right? I mean, contrast that to my explanations on many of your questions, right? And I always emphasize there's no single magic bullet. Like every issue needs to be approached on a multidimensional, basis, right? A social approach, a cultural approach, a technological approach, a business-oriented approach, right? They all need to be taken to address an issue like garbage problem or access to clean water, You don't just say, oh, downstreaming is the answer for everything, right? Just like you wouldn't say, oh, digitalization is the answer to everything, right? Digitalization is an important tool, but it's not, the magic bullet that's going to solve everything. Now, how do we get to sensible and coherent industrial policy? So I want to try to be a bit eccentric, to be interesting maybe. But so I'm a very back to basics kind of person, yeah. And if we contemplate the very phrase public servant, a public servant serves, right? And so a public servant doesn't necessarily have to come up with all the ideas, right? But a public servant needs to do what is in the service of the public, right? And so the fact of the matter is, the best ideas tend not to come from policymakers or from public servants. They come from the public, right? And our job as public servants serve those ideas is to implement those ideas, to craft policies or to revise policies, right? To optimize policies, to give those great ideas the best chance of succeeding, right? It's a marketplace of ideas. Sorry, jumping around to Floresita's question on synergy with civil society and private sector. It is about this kind of freedom. It is about, having the room, the space of freedom for civil society to criticize the business community, right? You're being too greedy, right? Criticize the policymakers. You're not internalizing the negative externalities. You're failing to tax the negative externalities. You're failing to subsidize the positive externalities. And then rationally, right? Rationally, come up with the conclusion that makes sense to everyone, right? Finds the most common ground, not only in the present, but on a forward-looking basis, right? Like the smartest politicians will gamble on the future, right? A lot of things which are not acceptable today will not only be acceptable 5 years from now, they'll be commonplace, right? And so you do have to be a bit forward-looking as you bet on a set of policies or even an industrial policy. But yeah, I'm a big believer in bottom up. A lot of my best ideas as trade minister or as becoming chairman didn't come from me, right? In fact, a lot of ideas, period, don't come from me. I consider myself more a great editor and collector and curator of great ideas than a great originator of great ideas, right? I just read a lot and I listen a lot and I collect a lot of ideas and I know which ones make sense and which ones don't make sense. Or some don't make sense now, might make sense later, right? So that's actually the kind of editorial function of a policymaker. Critical minerals program, just briefly to repeat that economists phrase, right? Anything that cannot continue will stop. And things which are forced, which are unnatural, right? Dipaksa, right? Will eventually hit the wall. Don't even have to do anything. And we already saw that in the collapse of nickel prices 2 years ago, bankrupting dozens of smelters, right? Now, government is like tightening mining quotas, whatever, and the price is rising, but it will create other problems again, right? So again, back to basics, right? Like as policymakers and politicians, we have to ask ourselves: is this natural? Like, will this happen naturally, right? Are you going with the grain or are you working against the grain? Working against the grain, are you doing it for a really good reason, right? Because you're more foresighted than the public is, and you're pushing for something extra progressive that the public will come around, in a few years' time, or you have another agenda, right? Mas Aditya on other cities, right? And it's very, very important because Indonesia is now according to United Nations and others, 69% urbanized. I understand the definition of city is minimum 50,000 inhabitants with a density of 1,500 inhabitants per square kilometer, right? But a definition like close to 60% of our public already lives in towns and cities, right? Like cities. So I still go back to this idea of a marketplace of ideas, right? So let everyone experiment, let everyone try different things, and let the best, most popular, the most revenue generating, most profitable ideas win, right? Within limits. I think we have to always carefully monitor for those negative externalities, right? Whether it's polluting, pollution, emissions, social costs, right? Like who's benefiting and who's the loser from whatever strategy any municipal government might be pursuing, right? Again, decentralization, right? Like let's empower mayors, district chiefs, bupatis around the region. Just try different things, and the public will evaluate, right? In time for the next election. Because I do think I really do believe in bottom-up solutions. Yeah, I think we need to delegate, empower those closest to the situation and trust them, right? But insist on accountability and transparency so that the public can judge objectively based on real data, yeah? On accurate reporting, budgets. What I would highlight is just the classic lack of imagination of policymakers, number one. Number two, the current complete lack of interest in policy innovations or reform or change, right? So I'll give you an example. We're earlier in the session planning about macet in Jakarta, right? Data, reality, history around the world shows there's only one solution for traffic jams, and that is congestion pricing, right? You build more roads, you'll end up with more cars, right? You build more MRTs, you build more everything. If you don't introduce market pricing, you will never solve congestion. And maybe that's a political decision, right? You just say, we accept that, right? After decades of debate, when people thought it would be impossible to implement congestion pricing in New York City, in Manhattan, they finally did it. And it's a massively successful experiment, right? It's raising hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue for New York City, possibly billions actually. And the average speed of traffic in Midtown Manhattan has improved by 40%, something, right? And everybody's happy. Nobody's complaining, right? Others are trying to shut that policy down, but facts on the ground clearly show that it's a massively successful policy. Congestion pricing. Now think about what traffic jams are, right? It's a mispricing. It's a very popular product, which is that stretch of asphalt at certain hours of the day, right? And what should normally happen in a normal market is when it's in high demand, the price should go up, right? Take the inverse. What is a stretch of empty road? It's an unpopular commodity. For example, the road at 2 a.m, right? Not only should it be free because nobody wants it, could arguably even subsidize people, right? Like you tax people who insist on being on a road at 5 p.m., 6 p.m., who insist on being on the road at 9 a.m., 10 a.m., and you subsidize people who are willing to be on the road at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., right? And for example, delivery trucks, logistics. This is why New York City has become a 24-hour city, right? They really make the most of their road infrastructure. A lot of traffic that doesn't have to be on the road at 5 p.m., 6 p.m., or at 9 a.m., 10 a.m. can be on the road at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m. So, which is where the night shift and the graveyard shift, sorry, as a New Yorker, you probably know better, right? Like night shift, graveyard shift, like that. But yeah, it's become a 24-hour city. But these congestion pricing schemes are also huge revenue generators, as it turns out. Again, taxing negative externalities, right? Garbage is a negative externality, so tax it, right? And again, applying the 80-20 rule, guess what? The 20% richest Jakartans probably produce 80% of Jakarta's garbage. Now, the richest 20% can afford to be taxed on garbage, right? Because we, I should include myself in that, we produce all that garbage, I mean, the bottom 80% of Jakartans don't produce all that garbage. That's a sad reality, but it's a reality, right? And so it takes a bit of data analysis, a bit of appreciation for data to show that this is the reality, right? 80-20 rule. And then what is needed is political will, right? To go and tax those 20% richest who produce 80% of the garbage. And guess what? History and experience suggests that 5 years later, everyone's happy. Even those richest 20% who are paying for it, who get taxed, right? Because we have housekeepers, we have help, we can hire people to sort our garbage, right? From serving under Pak Anies alongside Mas Dedi, Mas Will, and others, right? I learned that 60%, at least 50%, I would say more like 60% of Jakarta's garbage is organic waste. And the biggest ingredient in organic waste is water, right? And frankly, organic waste can be dealt with at the household level by composting, right? At the household level, at the building level, at the neighborhood level, at district level, right? So you would have a standardized composter, order dozens of them, right? And intercept the garbage at the household or building level, separate the organic waste that will reduce the contamination of the non-organic waste, that makes the non-organic waste easier to recycle, right? What makes plastics, metals, and other things expensive to recycle is you have to rinse it, you have to wash it, literally. You have to wash off the food waste, the organic waste from the plastics, from the paper, from the cardboard, the metals, right? That's very expensive. But if you separate the garbage at the outset, and again, I'm not suggesting we implement a system of like 7 different bins, like paper, plastic, whatever, right? Just 2, organic, non-organic, right? But we should be especially forceful on the top 20% of Jakartans by income. Start there, and then we go to the middle class, right? And so on. So these are examples, and penalties and taxes or excise like cukai on garbage can actually, you'd be surprised if you do numbers, it can be a massive revenue engine, right? Revenue source for municipal governments.
But Tom, we've had you on the hot seat for 2 hours now. Right. What I'm going to do, I think one last question from the audience, any burning last question, and one last from the online audience. Cecile, any questions coming from the audience? Okay, can we get one over there? Oh, where's Mumu?
Thank
If you can take one, I can't see.
Yeah.
So just one last question.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Tom. My name is Gema. I'm from the Ministry of Investment or BKPM. I'm very happy that you mentioned it multiple times because it means you remember us since 6 or 7 years ago. When you were chairman of BKPM, you gave us so much credibility and you gave us some kind of aura of professionalism. Thank you for it. My question is, I want to know your opinion on IKN because it is a new city, but it kind of the process is kind of on hold. But on hold. I want to know your comment on that. Yeah, thank you.
Gemma is an alum.
Yes.
Well, first, thank you, Mas Gemma, for speaking up, and it's always wonderful to meet colleagues from BKPM and from Ministry of Trade, especially young ones, right? The future generations. And I've always hugely enjoyed working with the young staff at BKPM, at Ministry of Trade, and everywhere, right? It's one of my great joys in life, mentoring young people. And thank you for your kind words, your compliments. Hopefully this gives you hope as well, yeah. I mean, in my experience in Ministry of Trade and BKPM, I can honestly say, I would say at least 70% of the staff are very professional and very capable. Really, truly, right? I mean, if you think about the selection process to become PNS, to enter those ministries, it's incredibly competitive, right? These people come from the top schools. They get fantastic exposure, right, to policy issues, the cutting edge of policy challenges, programmatic challenges, and so on, right? So I'm very, very proud of the at least 70%, possibly 80% of all of our bureaucrats across ministries and agencies. And more controversially, I would even say law enforcement agencies, aparat. Yeah. So what we're suffering from right now is the crisis of leadership. Yeah. And I want to emphasize we should not lay the blame unfairly on quite dedicated civil servants who do work hard and are actually trying to do their best, right? Now, IKN, New Capital City, right? I don't know if we can put these slides on screen, right? And this brings back memories from the presidential campaign, right? But Pak Anies or somebody in our team had the bright idea to pull up an old World Bank study from Damara, was it 2009 something? 2014, 14, which calculated how much would it cost to roll out all essential infrastructure to the 14 largest cities in Indonesia, right? And World Bank calculated that, oh yes, right there, 2014. We would need about 172 trillion rupiah to roll out clean water, basic sewerage, simple public transport, right, to 24 million people in 14 major cities, right? In contrast, IKN was budgeted at 460 trillion, and that's for just 2 million inhabitants sometime in the far future, right? And so, absolutely, IKN makes no sense, never has, possibly never will, right? Because even basic logical fallacies, right? Like, okay, people say, yeah, but Jakarta's sinking. So what are you going to do? Abandon Jakarta? Like, even you build IKN, you still have to fix Jakarta, right? And so it was just astonishing how the repressive approach, right? This oppressive, repressive, like suppression of debate, healthy debate, caused basic logical fallacies like that to escape, notice. And then was there like another slide? Like, oh, it's just okay. What are those major cities? Yeah. Where are we? I guess I should just verbalize, what those 14 major cities are. In the World Bank, it's Batam, Bangka, Bogor, Pontianak, Semarang, Surakarta, Solo, Surabaya, Gresik, Sidoarjo, Banjarmasin, Balikpapan, Makassar, Denpasar, and Lombok Barat, right? Those are the 14 major cities that for 172 trillion, you can provide, all the essential services, infrastructure, to 24 million people in those 14 cities, which is why during the campaign, we came up with a program called the 14 largest cities, right? Those should be the focus, not a single point in the middle of the jungle in East Kalimantan, but now a bit more brutal, right? 14 largest cities by population would be different from the World Bank list, would be Jakarta, Surabaya, Bekasi, Bandung, Medan, Depok, Tangerang, Palembang, Semarang, Makassar, South Tangerang, Batam, Bogor, Pekanbaru, right? The problem with that list, of course, 14 cities, 5 of them are in Jabodetabek, right? Tangerang, Tangsel, Bekasi, Depok, Bogor, right? And so then we realized, okay, we should expand this to 40 cities, right? 40 cities. And then you get to, you know, places like Ambon, Situbondo, Mataram, Cimahi, Jogja, Manado, Bengkulu, Jambi, Sukabumi, Jayapura, Cirebon, Pekalongan, Dumai, Jember, Kupang, and Palu, right? But this is an easy, low-hanging fruit to drive economic growth because throughout history, uh, rising economic growth has always been partially, at least, caused by rapid urbanization, right? Cities have far higher economic growth rates than non-cities, right? Doesn't mean we should neglect the countryside, right? And the synergies between countryside and cities, or what I call the supporting area, around the cities, is for another time. But no, getting a good urbanization policy would be one of the easiest way to pump up economic growth nationwide, because cities are by far the most productive conglomerations of people in any country, and right now they're very neglected. And you know what Karsa City Labs and ourselves try to do is to bring more forward-looking, technocratic, imaginative, coherent urban policies to as many cities as we can.
Thank you, Pat Tom. You reminded me of something a governor in the U.S. once told me, which was that if you really want to look deep, deep into the heart of a politician, look at their budget. That was very helpful and very insightful. I think everybody here feels enlightened and inspired after your talk here because of the realism of your approach to this. So let me thank you on behalf of Georgetown. And this being Indonesia, I think everyone would love to be able to have a photograph with you. So let's give them a hand.